The idea of putting together these sandpits or think tanks was one of the very first ideas that we had when bringing Opera North together with the University of Leeds for the DARE project. And what we wanted to do with the think tanks was to create a kind of shared space which was equally accessible to people from an artistic background or from an academic background. So we would put together literally a table with 15 chairs around it, and we'd invite people from all different backgrounds, all different areas of expertise, to have an equal democratic place around the table and to share a conversation about a shared topic. So obviously, if you were an academic, you would approach that from a very scholarly point of view, and if you were an artist, you might approach it from an entirely imaginative point of view, but you'd find a shared language and a shared vocabulary to talk about it. The first Sandpit that we did was on a very interesting theme, which is the idea of the music of the spheres. What is the music of the spheres? And we had mathematicians and astronomers, as well as artists. We had a musician, a composer, we had a writer there, and they all just enjoyed a conversation talking about what the music of the spheres might mean and how it gets interpreted through history and so on. After that, we did Sandpits on the story of Lulu, the Frank Wedekind play Earth Spirit, which gave rise to this figure of Lulu, the character of Lulu, that's been interpreted through film, opera, theatre, obviously, and that one was particularly interesting because we had a lot of visual artists from the university, or visual arts experts from the university, talking about German expressionism, talking about German history, and bringing those things to the table. And we had an opera director and we had a composer fielding thoughts on that. So this think tank is literally it is a think tank. It's a kind of a hotbed where people can really wrestle with a topic without there being a need for any kind of result at the end of it. The conversation is the point, is the purpose of the activity. So even though we talked about Lulu for 3 hours, there was no expectation that somebody would then go off and do a production of Lulu or write a novel about Lulu. It was just for the conversation for its own sake. Other think tank events that we've put together have included, we did one about the First World War, and we did one about what was called the end of antibiotics, what society and civilization is going to do when antibiotics stop working. We had medics, and we had for that one, as well as having medical scientists there, we also had quite a few people from medieval studies at the university who were talking about apocalypse narratives at the time of the around the millennium and the Black Death and times like this, and how culture and society had talked about the end of the world in sort of 1300, what people have been saying about the end of the world then. So the range of think tanks has been really startling, across scientific topics, artistic topics, operatic topics. I first met Stuart Murray about 3-4 years ago. We met at a DARE event, and we were just chatting, and he was talking about his autistic son and how he's written a lot. Stuart is an international expert on autism, and particularly on how autism is represented in culture. So how it is in film, how autism is shown in film or in theatre and in novels. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime and so on. And Stuart was really interesting about this, and we got to talking about how there hasn't really been a musical or an operatic representation of autism, and we were talking about how difficult it is to evoke ideas of autism through music and through performance, through live performance. At that time, we had a composer in residence with us, Cheryl Francis Hode, and Cheryl was part of this conversation, and we thought, okay, let's put together a think tank about autism and opera. And we got together Cheryl, who's a composer, Stuart, We brought a puppet maker from London, because we all had this idea that an autistic child, you wouldn't want somebody to act an autistic child, because it would just be a little bit false. But what if you used a puppet or animation or shadow or something like that? That might be a more interesting way of doing it. So we brought a puppet maker in, and we brought in a couple of academics on autism and neurological behaviour, a writer. We brought in a visual artist, and these people sat around a table and just talked for 3-4 hours about autism and performance. And at the end of it, this was the first time this had happened, at the end of it we all thought, actually we should make something. We should make a show of some kind, a performance piece of some kind. And one of the people who was at this think tank was Natalie Raybould, who's a singer. And she just had a kind of a very lovely sense about how a parent might be represented through song. And Cheryl had worked with Natalie before, and Cheryl had an idea about how she might write for Natalie, for Natalie's voice to be a parent. And even though we hadn't planned this at all, we realised that Stuart was really the only person who could write the libretto, who could write the words for the piece. We could bring in a writer, but they'd be, unless they had a direct experience of autism, they would be in a way ventriloquising the experience rather than living it. And Stuart, is a writer as well as a scholar. So we plucked up the courage and we said, "Okay, Stuart, you've got to write this." And he, slightly reluctantly at first, he said, "Oh, okay, I'll go away and write a couple of sketches and we'll see what we think of those." And then he came back with those, and we had a second Sandpit where we discussed those in more detail, and we looked at how the music might work with the words. And it slowly started to develop into something which we thought was really quite extraordinary, a very different way of approaching narrative, because the autistic experience of narrative isn't a beginning, a middle and an end. Each moment is the final moment or the first moment in itself. So it has to be a narrative that addresses autism, has to somehow take each moment as the full experience itself, rather than on a journey to the next moment, if you like, in the way a conventional narrative would work, where A leads to B leads to C. This has to be repetition is central to it. And Stuart has been incredibly generous in the project, but by which I mean he has brought things to the words that you can only experience if you're a parent of an autistic child. And he's been incredibly brave. He's gone into that territory and he's brought it back and he's shared it with the team. So for the first time, the think tank has actually led to something which I think is going to be an extraordinary piece of music theatre.